purpose of my book was to kind of rethink what had become to me an overly reductive and unhelpful definition of neoliberalism, which is that the belief was that neoliberalism proposed humans as merely homo economicus, merely calculating machines that weighed all decisions according to the economic outputs and the economic outcomes. And that the danger of neoliberalism was that it disenchanted the world entirely and stripped us of all meaning other than that can be acquired through the world of exchange and market existence. And that to me was not that helpful because to me that was more of a definition of capitalism as such. I mean, if you look at the way that Marx and Engels talk about capitalism in 1848, it's effectively that the veil has been torn away from the family and the kind of the mystical quality of the world, and religion is no longer with us because we have reduced everything to the cold rationality of the marketplace. So that can both be true, and in some ways I think it is true, and also be an unhelpful definition of neoliberalism, about what's unique about neoliberalism. And what it seemed to me as a historian is that neoliberalism was and is a kind of less a proposal about how humans are and more an answer to a question. And the question is, how do you reproduce capitalism under conditions of mass democracy, given the fact that people are often unhappy with the outcomes of capitalism as a system? So neoliberalism is a sort of evolving set of solutions to problems that capitalism can't help but produce. And putting that in history in the 20th century was quite productive for me, because the 20th century is really the time when mass democracy or universal suffrage becomes normalized across the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, most of the world was in colonial status. Geographically, the parts of the world that were in the metropole, the center of the empire, or had independence like the United States or Latin American countries, did not have anything close to universal suffrage. In every case, women were still denied the vote. The granting of the vote to women only happened sort of experimentally in the Paris Commune in the 1870s, but was quickly withdrawn. And it was only rolled out in exceptional cases around the time of the First World War, more after the First World War, and in places even like France, not until after the Second World War. So one thing that occurred to me was that, capitalism hadn't really had to deal with democracy until the 20th century. That it could reproduce itself in all of its inequalities by simply keeping some people out of the political picture and denying them voice in the political process. So the riddle now was, how do you expand voice, first of all, within rich Western populations to include people without property and the other half of humanity, women, and then expand it beyond Europe to the formerly colonial countries of Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America? How do you do that while preserving a system which has been proven to produce, jaw-dropping inequalities between populations and between parts of the world? So why would you expect people now to sign on to something that is a disaster for your own part of the planet? And this is something that the neoliberals, starting in the 1920s and 1930s, are sort of organizing around as a kind of a core question. The place that they see this first as a problem is in a way the first decolonization, which is the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, after the First World War, which also accompanied, of course, the end of the Russian Empire during the First World War, the end of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, and the triumph, in a way, of the nationality principle for the first time after the First World War. That also came along with a certain idea of self-determination and an idea of popular sovereignty at a national level that was more asserted than practiced until the era after the First World War. So these people like Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, sitting in Vienna, the center of the old Habsburg Empire, are watching the Habsburg Empire, which was the largest free trade zone in Europe, fragment into small self-determining nation states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary itself, the new Yugoslavian Federation, and so on. And they're asking the question, how do we make sure that this doesn't turn into a series of sort of autarkic, self-contained economic capsules that end up economically failing and breaking up the productive division of labor based on a misapprehension of what sovereignty means. Right? So these new nations have the wrong idea. They think that sovereignty is ownership. They think that to govern a country means to have the rights of access to everything within its borders. The neoliberals and liberals before them, classical liberals, thought that was a fundamental illusion. And in fact, property was global. Property was a principle that applied anywhere in the world. And sovereignty, as a political principle, was something that applied within borders, but should not be allowed to trump property. So this is the challenge then. How do you design institutions that safeguard the rights of property over borders in an era when everyone is talking about national sovereignty and national self-determination and democracy in ways that might invalidate or cross out that universal right to property? And the story of the Geneva School, as I talk about in my book, is the kind of the search for institutions that will safeguard property rights over borders and safeguard the right of trade of goods and money to move over borders in an era of democracy and national self-determination. They have some candidates in the 20th century that they think might be potential guardians for the world economy. The League of Nations, which was founded after the First World War, was actually very interested also in reproducing a kind of interdependent free trade order. Unfortunately for them, it was the United States did not participate, which was kind of a problem because the United States was the world's biggest economy after the First World War. After 1945, the United Nations seemed like it might be a possible space for reconstructing an interdependent, open, liberal world economy. But it turns out that at the UN, the nationality principle did trump the sovereignty principle. And new countries from Latin America or Asia were actually interested in being able to appropriate foreign property and sort of assert what was called the permanent sovereignty over natural resources. So the story that I tell in the book about the Geneva School is people who are sort of trying to understand a governance structure that might work globally to ensure capital rights as global. And they found themselves disappointed decade after decade as the tide seemed to be moving in a different direction. As different forms of socialism were popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s, as the Soviet Union became the center for, of course, a radically different form of political economy as the sort of nest place of global communism. And it was a century of disappointment in a way for the Geneva School that I describe in my book. And they only sort of saw light at the end of the tunnel in the 1990s with the end of communism in Eastern Europe and the consensus around the need for strong institutions that would not just advocate for free trade, but protect and enforce it. And this is where the sort of the gemstone of the World Trade Organization comes in. This is the kind of culmination in a way of a century's search for an institutional fix for the problem of national sovereignty and national democracy. And in the minds of neoliberals, they ended up being wrong, but in their minds, this was a way that national sovereignty could be overruled and nations could effectively be compelled, once they had signed on to the WTO, to participate in a free trade world order. So the Geneva School, as I describe it in my book, is a kind of, it's a century-long project of multi-level governance as the solution to a fundamental quandary of political economy in the modern era, namely the conflict between private capital rights and democratic public rights. So one of the things that I use in the book are the categories that they use themselves, so, which they borrow from Roman law. And these are the categories of dominium and imperium. And dominium is the sphere of property that is the sphere of ownership, and you could say private law. The other category is imperium, which is the sphere of administration, government, and sovereignty, and it's more like public law. So in the minds of the neoliberals, there's a kind of a double world in capitalism. There's on the one hand the world of dominion and property, which is global, and then there's the world of imperium, which is segmenting the world into spaces of national governments. They wanted an arrangement that could allow for dominion to trump imperium. Did that mean that they wanted to go back to the world of empire? Well, it depends on how you look at the world of empire. I mean, in many ways, empires themselves weren't very good guardians of this world economic institution, if we think about it that way, right? Most empires practiced some form of discrimination against other empires and nations, and protected their own products in their colonies. So for the neoliberals, there was a lot of bad empires, and there was kind of one good empire, and that empire was the British Empire. And it was the good empire because they were the one empire to routinely practice what was called an open door policy. So the British Empire actually did allow economic interests from other empires and nations to trade and invest within their colonies. They didn't prevent that from happening. So that is a kind of ideal form of empire for the neoliberals, a kind of a so-called universal empire, which saw as its own role not its own self-interest, but as a kind of enforcer of a norm of free trade, free access, free investment, and the sanctity of private property and wage labor. So this was a kind of, you could say it's an ideal version of the 19th century empire, but one that actually wasn't practiced most of the time in the 19th century itself. So I think that the interesting thing about the empire question with the neoliberal imagination is it's true on two scales. So at the highest scale, they did want a kind of a global enforcer that could guarantee free trade and capital rights. But the other thing that they were interested in about empire is that empires were actually very pluralistic internally, and they had actually, not a single form of law within the empire, but different laws governing different territories, different laws governing different populations. And this is the kind of the definition of an empire is multinational and actually multi-legal. So actual existing empires in the 19th century were a kind of a patchwork of different jurisdictions that had different governance structures, and that the capitalists of the 19th century used very much to their own benefit. So a good example there is China in the 19th century, right? At the conclusion of the Opium Wars was the creation of a series of concessions or treaty ports on the coast of China, which could then be inhabited extraterritorially, as they say, by foreign capitalists who then had guaranteed access to the Chinese market, but did not have to worry about the Chinese, asserting their laws over them, because the enclaves were also legal entities. in the exact same way that the special economic zones and the export processing zones of the 21st century are these kind of legally distinct enclaves. So, in that sense, the neoliberals were enamored with empire at both levels. At the highest level, because of its universality, at least in theory, and at the smallest level, because that heterogeneity and diversity of jurisdictions actually allows, opportunities for arbitrage and profit making as you use the laws of all of these small enclaves in a way that helps your own particular enterprise. So they liked both. They liked the uniformity of it, but they also liked the heterogeneity of it. What they didn't like was the middle ground of the nation state, at least in theory, because that's where people got the wrong idea about what democracy meant. That's where people had the illusion that popular sovereignty meant control over property. It's a good question. I've always thought that the funny thing about the word empire is that it has an implicitly negative connotation, of course, right? So it's often the worst insult that you can use to describe a power in the late 20th and early 21st century is to say it's acting like an empire, or it's acting in an imperial way, right? This is a slur that's used, or a charge that's used by, let's say, American critics of American foreign policy. It's acting imperially. Or European critics of European Central Bank or the European Commission, that it's turning turning Europe into a German empire. But I think that this implies too much consistency to what empire is and what it has meant historically. I think that when we talk about this vision of a kind of a single global regime, which would be the way that someone like, Hart and Negri would use the category of empire. In fact, the only nation in modern times to have come anywhere close to this is the United States, which, at least formally speaking, is not an empire, but which has, I think, been able to use its power to exercise something close to global universal control at different times in history through proxy institutions that act effectively as an extension of its own hegemony. And this is relevant for your question about post-colonial nations, because I think nowhere is this starker than in the transformation of the Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF and the World Bank into effectively overseas operating arms of the American financial system. The third world debt crisis in the 1980s really did turn the IMF from being what it had been designed to be, which is a kind of a coordinating office to allow for degrees of autonomy within national financial system. That's what it was designed to be. It's not designed to enable hyperglobalization or to guarantee investor rights. It was designed to provide for a level of self-control amongst different nation states. In the 1980s, the United States government, Treasury Department, in consultation with the leading financial institutions, decided that it would look better if they went debt collecting, basically, not as the US government or as Citibank or Chase Manhattan, but if you did it through something that was more neutral appearing, like the IMF. And this is quite an easy history to write because a lot of these materials are freely available on the internet through the IMF website and the Federal Reserve website, which is extensive and really great to use for study. But this is a situation where, conditions were imposed on nations in the wake of the huge interest rate rises. Conditions were imposed on the global South nations for the loans that were necessary from the IMF to pay back their private creditors. And these conditions were so extreme that they effectively deprived those post-colonial nations of the hard-fought sovereignty that they had left the area of empire with. You know what I mean? So there are ways in which I think the universal extension of American control through the proxy institutions of the IMF and World Bank did kind of reproduce the same level of subordination that post-colonial nations had once had under empire by different means. And that's, I'm obviously not the first person to suggest that, and that's very common lament on the part of activists and citizens in the global South countries. But the more that I study it through the sources, the more I tend to agree with that description. I think that it is true that this combination of American geopolitical power and the tremendous influence of international financial institutions has indeed put much of the world into a state where it's effectively recolonized. That's, interestingly enough, not really the way that the neoliberals that I read about in my book would have liked to see it happen. I think that, to me, one of the most insightful things that Hayek has to say is that market power works best when it's anonymous, works best in the sense that produces the kind of outcomes that he wants, not works best in my opinion, but that this, in a way, is the real riddle of neoliberal power, is how can you assert power without actually appearing to be asserting it? And I think that there are times in which this is effective, where people do feel powerless in the sense that, the closing of their factory or the disappearance of investment from their country just feels natural. It feels like something that happened the same way a storm can hit you, or you can have a blizzard or an earthquake. This is, one of the ways that I think historians have been very helpful recently is by showing how many of the things that we think are new about questions of artificial intelligence, for example, have been debated heavily for a very long time, at least since the 1950s and 60s in public. And in fact, going back to the calculation debates of the 1920s, even earlier. So I think that this question of, to what extent can human behavior be predicted and automated and substituted by machines is not a 21st century problem. It's actually a 20th century problem. And in that sense, we should put it alongside the questions of democracy and global capitalism. It's something that's a problem of the modern world. And the attraction of thinking of humans as information processors, which is what Hayek thought, is, first of all, it lends itself, of course, well to a kind of what economists would call kind of a parsimonious modeling, meaning you can ignore a lot of complicating things and just focus on a formally elegant model of human behavior for the sake of coming to an insight about how collectives work. And so when Hayek thinks about humans as information processors, he's creating analogies between humans and then the animal kingdom, but also cosmology. So he's drawing attention to the similar ways in which humans operate as complex, self-organizing systems to the way that galaxies do, but then also at a micro level, the way that neurons operate, within the tissue of the human body. And it's not a coincidence that Hayek was interested, first of all, in becoming a neurologist, and he spent a summer in Zurich in his late teen years helping to kind of dissect animals and look at the way that their neurons function. So it's a decentering of the human as the specialness and the uniqueness of the humans, and it's a way of saying actually humans are just like other complex systems in the world, and they shouldn't be treated with such reverence in a way. So when you think about it that way, your first insight should be well, then I guess this is a recipe for absolute laissez-faire, because humans will self-organize. Bears don't have governments. Neurons don't have governments. Why do humans need governments if we're just another complex system? But Hayek's, second sort of caveat there is that we think we're different from galaxies, neurons, and bears, and that actually makes all the difference. Because we think that we're different, it means we undergo and undertake disruptive processes of organization that end up tampering with the kind of the magic self-organizing quality of our own societies. So we start to think, we start to exercise what he calls the pretense of knowledge, which is kind of like the hubris or the pride of knowledge. We think that we know too much, and we think that we can organize societies from the center or from the top down using rational planning processes, using, say, computers that tell everyone where their labor will be most effectively used, and that the price of bread should be this and the price of machinery should be that. And this is what he sees as the kind of the biggest problem of modern humanity, is the belief that we can program the system ourselves, basically, rather than being humble, is the way he would talk about it, being humble in the face of rules over which we only have limited power. And so if humans, as he seek to kind of maximize their own power and their own wealth, and they seek to engage with other humans in order to further expand their own power and wealth, and in doing so, they solve problems, because solving problems allows them to then amass more power and wealth, then we need to come up with institutions and laws that simply step back and create the institutional framework within which those natural processes can unfold, and nothing more. So in his mind, that means protection of the sanctity of private property. It means the suppression of collective efforts towards redistribution or the transformation of mass life. It means the necessity of inequality. He doesn't see inequality as just an evil that we have to live with, but it has a utility. That he talks about the kind of the positive feedback effect of disappointment in economic life. So if your business fails, that's not just unfortunate, that's actually positive, because it now will force you to, compel you to work better next time. So he sees the model of success and failure in the business world and the incentive of profit as being the feedback mechanisms that actually produce a better outcome for the entire system. And in that sense, it's not about money. Money is simply a tool that allows us to better transmit information from one person to the next in a way that expands the corpus of knowledge available to all humans. So it's a very strange, it's in many ways a social Darwinian approach to the world, and that has been recognized even by people who are sympathetic to Hayek. So his critics call him a social Darwinist all the time, but even Hayekians will sometimes concede that this is a social Darwinist way of looking at the world, in the sense that more economically efficient populations will simply reproduce themselves more productively, and less economically efficient populations with, let's say, forms of morality and tradition that are not as conducive to capitalism will shrink and die out, and that's good. He sees that as good. The quote he has in his final book, The Fatal Conceit, is that the calculus of costs is the calculus of lives. So I think I think Hayek is challenging to our ideas of ethics and morality in ways that we don't often recognize. I think that people think that the sin of neoliberalism is that it's overly individualistic and that it's an overly selfish ideology. But in fact, the way that Hayek talks about things, neoliberalism is very much focused on the collective and the totality. And that's maybe actually no better, because it's saying because of the collective and the totality, we must live with all kinds of forms of injustice and punishment within a capitalist system, because not because individuals are the king, but because in a way the collective is the king. So, I've been studying this stuff long enough to see several rounds of people ask the question, is neoliberalism dead? And each time the answer is no, because what neoliberalism is tends to change and adapt quite effectively to whatever new crisis has arisen. So the kind of neoliberalism that was practiced, let's say, in Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s is not the same as the neoliberalism of the IMF. It's not the same as the neoliberalism of the very much financially driven, central bank dependent recovery style of neoliberalism that followed 2008, which is not the same as the kind of neoliberalism through the government of the Troika in the European Union in the 2010s. So most of the time, the answer to this is easy, which is just, no, it's not dead. What form is it taking next? Because I think that the grip of neoliberalism in the sense of placing a certain vision of free markets at the center of the rationality of government is so ingrained in the major political parties in Europe and the United States that there is no way to think outside of it. So I think we're basically in this kind of iron cage of neoliberal rationality in its different varieties, whether it's the Trumpian version or the Biden-like version. That's because of a long evolution of thinking in these parts of the world that has actually led to the infiltration of certain assumptions into political messaging and political program writing that that is path dependent in a way that I don't really see a way of breaking out of, unless it would be a radical move like a Bernie Sanders, for example, which just didn't happen. China, on the other hand, has been part of a totally different lineage of canon building and problem solving and rationality creation that has moments of overlap with what we would call the neoliberal intellectual tradition, but has been much more autonomous in its development than what has happened between, let's say, the political parties of Western Europe, the UK, and the US, which have been, I think, part of a kind of a shared development since the 1970s, a slow movement towards neoliberal assumptions, and then now an inability to break out of them. China has been engaged in, of course, the largest experiment in economic history in the last 40 years, but especially the last 20 years. Never in history has any country so rapidly gobbled up market share worldwide and increased its capacity for both manufacturing and consumption and service production in China. So, I mean, that's the first thing to realize, is that we are bearing witness to the most extraordinary phenomenon in economic history. What the governing rationality of that is, I think, the single biggest question facing international political economy today. I am very unsatisfied with calling it neoliberalism. And I follow here people who know China much better than I do. Someone whose work I respect very much is a woman named Isabel Weber, who's a German economic historian. And this is precisely her whole sort of project right now, is to say, get beyond the neoliberal or not neoliberal question when it comes to China. We need to understand, especially the size of China and the way that Maoism worked was a very peculiar combination of decentralization and central control, which the Cultural Revolution itself, the high point of Maoism, was a time where the central control was Mao devolving power down to the local level in a very extreme way, right? Giving power to school children against their teachers, workers against the factory owners, peasants against the local party leaders. So it was both a highly centralized act, dictated from the center, but one that sanctioned an absolute level of decentralism or decentralization. That kind of turned China into like this chaotic field of experimentation in the 1960s and early 1970s. And there are people who credit that in some ways with releasing a kind of creative and even entrepreneurial energy, a capacity for self-experimentation at the local level, which then was carried over into the Deng Xiaoping liberalization era, even though anyone looking at it from outside would think this was a 180-degree shift from sort of radical Maoist communism led by the Red Guards to something very different, which begins to resemble capitalism under Deng Xiaoping. People who know the era don't see it that way at all. They see much more of a continuity of a surprising kind, because the way that liberalization happened and continues to happen in China is through a careful devolution of power down to the galaxy of special economic zones, which is what China is now, combined with a certain degree of state control, which produces huge umbrella, sort of limited liability companies to make sure that parts of the country compete with each other, but that preferences can be shown when it seems like, for political reasons, one region needs to be preferred over another. So it's a combination of local initiative and central party loyalty building, which has now been, of course, expanded outwards beyond China's borders through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also this combination of winning clientele networks beyond the borders of China, allowing for the entrepreneurial initiative of local investors, while also retaining some kind of a veto power at the center. And for me, even this rudimentary understanding of how Chinese capitalism is working now just doesn't fit at all with the neoliberal canon. I can't. People have tried. I mean, Andrew Neil, a famous journalist in the UK, former editor of The Spectator, and he described it as Hayekian. He tried to do this thing where he said, China is more Hayekian than Europe. China is more Hayekian than the US, because they're allowing for this very experimentation, local and information deployment, and so on. I think it's a stretch. I don't know why we would have to use Hayek to understand China. I think the challenge now to understand China is use Chinese sources to understand China, and reconstruct and sort of rely on experts to reconstruct the intellectual development of economic reasoning within China in a way that doesn't have to go back to our intellectual, lodestars and poles of orientation. I think this is something that the United States and Europe is not coming to terms with yet, is that whether neoliberalism lives or dies, what the state of the world economy will be in the next decade and 2 decades is in a way out of their hands. They don't have the sovereignty of interpretation that they once did. China is in many ways the dominant world superpower of economic production. And what China decides to do is arguably more important than what Brussels decides to do. Washington and Brussels is going to be ever more in a reactive mode vis-a-vis Beijing. And the first step then should be trying to understand better exactly what's happening in China. And it's amazing to me how few people in the United States and Europe actually feel like any pressure to do so. Do you know what I mean? I think that it's much more common to simply try to project onto China something that has already happened in the West, rather than to try to understand it as something that has its own internal autonomous dynamics, because that's much harder. I mean, ironically, or maybe poetically, it does recall the way that China was treated in the 19th century by the by the Western imperial powers, right? Um, because from what I understand, I mean, the BRI is, yes, focused on infrastructure, but then specifically focused on, relationships of credit and debt, which make it possible, if not likely, that ownership of that infrastructure might return to China, given default, or right, it gives privileged access to fishing waters and things like that um, for Chinese interests. I know that in Iran, for example, that to take the BRI money means that there's things about the use of wheat of Chinese payment systems and Chinese technology, Huawei, 5G infrastructure, and so on. So it's a kind of neo-mercantilist version of overseas expansion, in the sense that it doesn't seek a kind of a global solution off the top, but it's working through sort of piecemeal material expansion and winning clients and locking them into dependency in a sort of incremental way. And that for sure has its predecessors in world economic history. The history of the expansion of things like telegraph networks, for example, or indeed extractive industries across Latin America in the 19th century would look a lot like this, right? Would mean British investors would come in, they would build a mine, they would build a refinery, and then you'd be living under the kind of security umbrella of the British. If you defaulted, you'd have to pay back the British. I mean, that's to me what it looks more like, is 19th century style neo-mercantilist imperialism, which isn't interested in the universal claim of jurisdiction. And that's, I think, what makes it interesting and a break with the 90s style rhetoric and political initiatives, right? Which, I mean, the World Trade Organization is the giveaway there, right? The belief that what you're doing is for the globe, which is what makes it globalist, obviously. This model that the Chinese is using, I would hesitate to call globalist, because in the sense that it's not claiming to be intervening at the scale of the planetary, right? I mean, it is in a way a more modest and arguably more effective way of exerting Chinese economic power beyond its borders, because it's not operating through multilateralism the way that the WTO is, right? I mean, the WTO, despite its grand claims, was ultimately only as powerful as its nations let it be. Right? This is the way international law is. It's only so powerful as long as the people who have signed on to a given treaty agree to go along with the treaty. What happened in 2016 and since is the US has simply withdrawn its consent from participation, and the thing is gone, right? The seemingly all-powerful globalist organization proves to have no power at all. So that's one way of exercising economic power, is through multilateral legal organizations. The Chinese model through the BRI, to me, is much more effective, because it doesn't use this pretense of legal principles and kind of high-minded universal uplift. It simply says, it makes patron-client relationships work at its border, and then extends that a little further and a little further. And it's never spoken of in terms other than, mutual self-interest, and not sort of the abstract betterment of civilization, which is what Western-style liberalism has been doing, arguably, since the Spanish, got the right to convert the natives in the 1500s. Right? The claim of building a universal civilization is what the West's version of global history has been all about for the last 500 years, from Cortez to Napoleon to Truman, it's been about, we're bringing the world to a more elevated place. And the Chinese have simply no history of that. And for good reason now, they're not embracing that sort of what's ultimately been a totally destructive and misguided attempt at transforming the world, I think, in a lot of ways. So that's another thing that we haven't come to terms with. I think the American commentary is committed to either talking about globalization or deglobalization. And the idea that there might be something different or in between, like a variety of exercising power regionally and through the extension of infrastructure networks, the way the Chinese are doing it, there's just literally not a word for it in the American economic jargon. And that's obviously something that's going to have to change if we want to understand anything at all.